Hey, good morning. I'm excited to be back with you guys. That video there is a guy named Alan Hirsch. I'm just curious, how many of you ever heard of Alan Hirsch before? Anybody? A couple of you guys? Okay. Alan is a guy that I've had the privilege of meeting a couple times, and through some coaching stuff, was able to sit and listen to some of his teaching. Him and his wife both. He is based in Los Angeles and travels around the world and speaks about mission, about the church, and about this idea of being incarnational. Over the last month, through going back to the beginning of December, we've been talking about this idea of incarnation, and we said it has to do with this idea of God walking among us. But not just God walking among us, but then as Christ rose from the grave and ascended to heaven, the idea then that he commissioned us as followers of Christ to walk among the people within our neighborhoods, within our workplaces, within the community that we call home, right? And so that's what we've been talking about over the last month. Some of you have been in and out over that last month. I would encourage you to go back and listen to some of those messages from our Flesh and Bones series. The reason, and you guys might be, why do we even talk about that? And why are we even doing that today? I'm curious how many of us, when we enter into the new year, we set like resolutions. How many of you guys set resolutions for the new year? Anybody? And some of you there's a couple hands, and some of you guys are like, well, I have some, but I really don't want to tell people because then I'll be held accountable to them, right? We set all kinds of different things that we want to do for the new year, right? I'm curious how many of us this new year have said, I want to see God in a different light. I'm curious, how many of us this new year have said, I want to see God in a different light? How many of us look over the last year and we can see maybe some ups and downs, some valleys and some mountaintop experiences with God? And as we enter into this new year, how many of us want to have more mountaintop experiences than maybe the valleys? And how many of us maybe want to handle those valleys a little bit better than what we did last year, right? What if I were to tell you that I believe this idea of incarnation is central to us having maybe a renewed experience with God? I think it is. And again, over the last month, we've talked about, okay, what is this idea of incarnation? And today we're going to do something a little bit different. In a minute, I'm going to call a couple guys up here. And we're just going to have a conversation. Before that, though, I want to read to you a passage. It's in John chapter 1. I would encourage you to look up John chapter 1. If you're kind of new to this whole thing, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are kind of the beginning of the New Testament. New Testament is about 2/3 of the way through this book we call the Bible. And in John chapter 1, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. And you read that, you might be like, what the heck was that? Right? Well, the Word is just referring to Jesus. In the beginning was Jesus, and Jesus was with God, and Jesus was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life. In Jesus was life, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness doesn't understand it, right? There came a man who was sent from God. His name was John. And he's talking about John the Baptist we've talked about before. He came as a witness to testify concerning this light, so that through him all men might believe. He himself was not the light. John the Baptist was not the light. John the Baptist was not God came to walk with us. He was just showing the way as God entered into our place, into our residence. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light. The true light that gives light to every man was coming into the world, was coming to walk with us. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. Even though God made the universe, made the world that we live in, the communities that we live in, many times it's saying he is not recognized within those communities, right? He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. So we didn't recognize him, and we did not even receive him. Yet to all who received him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision, or even a husband's will, but born of God. The Word, Jesus, became flesh, and it says, made his dwelling among us. Jesus became flesh. God incarnate became flesh and made his dwelling among us. This word dwelling is an interesting word in the Greek, which the New Testament was written in Greek. Is the Greek word for dwelling is shana. And that doesn't mean anything to any of us, right? But shana actually is broken down, and it says that the Word became flesh and pitched his tents among us. He pitched his tents. He built his home among us. I want us to unpack that a little bit as we've done the whole last month. And again, I would encourage you to go back and listen to some of those messages, because the idea that I really want us to get out of this is God came in flesh, walked among us, lived among us, to point us to who God truly was. But as we've been saying the whole series, God then chose to send us, those of us that know Jesus, those of us that understand the light that was talking about, into the places that we reside to show that light to the people around us that have not received it, have not recognized it. What if I were to tell you this year that if we choose as a people, to follow after God, but in that pursuit after Christ, to know him better, to understand him better. I mean, how many of you completely understand God? I don't. But if we pursue this year to say, how do I understand God better? How do I understand who he is and his attributes and how he walks with me, how he challenges me, the things that he has me walk through? What if I choose, to walk in that direction, but what if I also choose, B, to live this idea of incarnation, to let others see Christ through me? And so this morning, I want to break down a little bit more on a more practical level through the idea of stories, through the idea of just a conversation that a couple of us want to have. I thought the best way to do this was not to preach a sermon to you, was not to give you a bunch of different points and say, here's how you do this, but to present to you 6 things that I think are instrumental in this idea of incarnation, of us being incarnational, because many people don't talk about this, but present to you these 6 different things within the context of having a couple of us share with you and even among us some stories. I want to ask Mike Hicksonball and Jeff to come back up here. I wanted these guys to sit this morning and to share some stories. And it's funny, these guys are like completely nervous because I'm texting them throughout the week. I'm like, hey, will you just come up on stage this week? And they're like, what do you want me to do? Oh, we're just going to share stories. What are you talking about? So these guys have come up very bravely. And the reason I did that, I wanted it to be very natural. I wanted it for you to see how we are trying to live these ideas out. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? And so I didn't want this to feel staged. I didn't want this to feel, kind of like this, kind of churchy, right? I wanted this to feel very real and very, okay, how do we live this idea of incarnation? Let me, you guys are going to want to write these down. Grab a pen, put these on your phone. Grab something, because this is kind of the outline that we're going to be talking about this morning. And I would encourage you, maybe your New Year's resolution this year is to bring a pen and a Bible. Because you can write all kinds of stuff in here that we talk about that you'll go back to and read later. How many of your New Year's resolution is actually to read the Bible? That's fantastic. I would encourage you to do that. You have to start somewhere. And sometimes the best place to start is maybe the stuff that we're talking about on Sunday. And you go back sometime throughout the week and you start reading it and you say, God, share that with me. Show me something through that. And then maybe you share that with a spouse, with a friend, with me, on Facebook, whatever it might be. But 6 things that I think are instrumental to this idea of incarnation. The first one is presence. Presence. And that's basically to identify with a people group. How many of you are Navy? Just curious. Or have been Navy? Connected to Navy? A lot of our Navy people are actually gone this week because of travel and holidays. But ideally, Awaken is made up, guessing it's probably close to 50% Navy. And I love our Navy. And I've had to ask myself, why is that? Why do I love the Navy so much? Because I was never in the Navy, and people ask me, oh, were you Navy? No. Because it's like so real. A lot of the Navy guys I meet and ladies, they're just like so real. This is the way it is. And kind of how I grew up and where I came from, that just resonates. And so this idea of presence is understanding and identifying the people that are around you. The second one is proximity. I think many times that if we're not careful, those of us that are in a church, and I've seen this happen time and time and time again, we close ourselves off from those that are outside the church. And as I look at Jesus was maybe the exact opposite of that. And so it's about having proximity within the people that are around you. And we're going to talk about that. The third one is prevenience. And all that word means is trusting that God is already at work. Prevenience is trusting that God is already at work. The fourth one is powerlessness. I know in our day and age, we want to have swagger, right? I think we talked about that a couple months ago. We want to have swagger. And as you read through the scriptures, it's actually Jesus was a servant. And so even though Jesus had extreme power, he showed a lot of powerlessness. And we're called to the same. The passion of Christ. And all that means is the sufferings of Christ. And how do we suffer within the context of this idea of incarnation? And the last one is proclamation. Is lovingly and boldly proclaiming who God is within our lives. And so I wanted these guys to come up, and I want us just to have a conversation over each one of these, and maybe we'll just go down through the list and talk about ways you've seen this happen within your life, ways you've seen difficulty within some of this within your lives, and myself as well. And my hope is that maybe this morning we can learn together. So I'm going to pray, and we'll get started just conversing. Lord Jesus, thank you for the new year. Lord, thank you for the opportunity to talk about the incarnation once again. Father, I truly believe that this idea can change our perspective of you. I believe, Lord, this idea can change what this year looks like for us as a people. Lord, I believe that this idea can change our families, can change our perspective on life, can change the trials that we go through, can change so many different aspects of our lives. Father, I pray that this morning would be, if nothing else, just encouraging. And it would help us to understand better what it means to represent you within the places that we live, what it means to share you with others within the places that we live, what it means to just be real within the places we live, Lord. Let that come out here this morning. In your precious name, Jesus, amen. Cool. So let's just start with presence, guys. What comes to mind when you think about presence, to identify with a certain people?
So
One of the reasons I ask these guys too is they're never short on words. So go ahead.
Can I talk now? All right.
No, yeah.
So when I'll be honest, I have not thought a ton since Mike asked me to do this. I've not thought a ton about what I was going to say, but fortunately, I have thought a lot about this concept over the past year or so. But without the knowledge of the term incarnation, in my mind, it's we're talking about just living in our communities and just being a part of the community, and that's something I've thought quite a bit about over the last year. And I thought about it last night, and you read the verse, the Word became flesh, and He made His dwelling among us. It doesn't say the Word became flesh, and He set up a club and invited, tacked some flyers on a board and invited some people to come and learn what it might mean to be a part of the club. And no, he lived among people, and Jesus had a presence in people's lives on their terms. And so He didn't turn down an invite to that rad party with the money launderer and the prostitutes. He hung out with them and was a positive presence in their lives. And so we live in Portsmouth, and we have a community group out there that we hope to someday maybe see turn into a church. It might look different than what we do here. It's a different community. But for the last year, we moved into our new home a year ago, and we made a commitment to have presence in our neighbors' lives and in the community. And the greatest example, my wife really should be up here, my wife Bethany, who is much more introverted than me, knowing all of this last year around New Year's, I guess there's this new thing where instead of a resolution, you just pick a word to dwell on. You want this word to be your theme for the year. And
Buckeyes. Oh, I'm sorry.
She went with open. And by that, she meant just her door will be open. She'd be open to saying yes to social activities. And my introverted wife made so many connections in the community as a stay-at-home mom, meeting moms, making friends. And this week, we threw a New Year's brunch where we invited several people from different parts of our life. And just by coincidence, we looked around, we had about 20 people in our house, and all but 2 of them we'd met this year.
Wow.
And most of them lived in Portsmouth. And we didn't plan that. We weren't trying to let's have a victory party for all the people we've met. It just showed that without realizing, she had made that a priority to have a presence in the community, and it's just natural.
That's cool. That's cool. What would you say about some of this, Jeff?
I think the guy who we just heard talk is Alan Hirsch. He's the same guy that the last couple of times that I've spoken, that I've had the 4 L's, and now he's got 6 P's. I think I read an article, a post that he had done, and on this first one, presence, it was this idea of finding a group of people that you identify with, that you can have presence with those people. And I think it can be as simple as geographically where you live. It can be as simple as your neighborhood, but I don't think it has to be. I've never been real good at being neighborly ever. I like to think it's not my fault, but people tend to move a lot. Like, for example, the house that I'm in now, we've been there about 5 years, and just on either side of me, we've had 6 neighbors. People don't tend to stay there very long. So
not him.
Yeah, no, it's not me. It's just the townhouses immediately connecting to mine keep leaving, but it has nothing to do with me.
That's what we keep telling them, Mike.
But it's cool. The guy that had lived there the longest, I ran into recently, and so even though it sometimes is frustrating to invest in somebody and then have them leave like that, I ran into him and was able to still continue some of that a little bit. But so I think it can be as simple as geographically the neighborhood that you're in, but I think, like you said, it can be the Navy, these are your people that you identify with, that you want to be a part of their lives, and and I think it could be as simple as the people that you work with. For me, it has always been the music scene. I've been playing in bands since I was 17 years old, and those have always been, the places where I've felt the most drawn to, the people that I've felt the most connection with, that I just have this longing for, to serve and to love and to share the gospel with those people. Those would be the people that have always tugged on my heart the hardest. And so when I think of presence, like I said, it can be as simple as your neighborhood, and I think for a lot of people it is, but for me it's always been kind of a more vague idea of this scene, this group of people that I've been a part of for a long time. So, that's kind of where I've identified as my mission field and the people that I feel the most connected to.
As we look at this idea of presence and proximity, and I would agree that it's not just a specific place, but it can also be a group of people, a tribe of people that move. But the idea that the thought that continues to come back to me with this whole idea is just intentionality. Bethany this year saying, I will be open. I will be intentional is basically what she was saying. And I think that it's easy, and that's why I wanted us to have more of a conversation. I think it's easy to say, okay, I need to be present for people. I need to be, close to people. And you guys have heard me say multiple times, a place I go is Starbucks, and just try to build new relationships. And it's kind of funny. It's a bunch of retired guys that God has me talking to, and building relationships with, sharing Jesus with. One guy read a book I recommended to him. And I would never would have guessed retired guys, I'm nowhere near that. All right. But I think it's just, I don't know, being intentional. What would you guys think about that? Just the idea of intentionality behind this.
Yeah, I think especially in our culture, I often think that the church overcomplicates things, and so it's important that we have talks like this, but really what we end up getting to is we just need to live like people. And so we have to be intentional in our culture to go greet our neighbor when we're moving into a new neighborhood, because it's much easier in our culture to not do that, because we block each other off. One of my favorite Seinfeld episodes is when George Costanza, all of the different people from different parts of his life converge in one place, and he's like, my worlds are colliding, And that's how I used to be. I did not want my work friends who I have proximity with to be hanging out with, my church friends to be hanging out with, my friends who I like to make beer with. I just didn't want all those things mixed together. And I think that part of the thing that we have to overcome is the cultural barrier of staying private and keeping to ourselves. And so we can be near somebody physically, but have never said hello to the neighbor in our cul-de-sac or wherever. You can't just, it depends on your personality. For me, this does kind of come more naturally. I'm a people person. Mm-hmm. But really, to do this, to live like Jesus lived, you have to consciously think about it. And I want to be clear that it doesn't mean you're being manipulative or going into all of your relationships with people with you're on mission, but you're also not going to simply satisfy your need to follow what Jesus said. You're also just making friends, which is healthy.
Absolutely.
So it's just part of this is just stop thinking so much and just be someone's friend.
I think regardless of whether we're introverted or extroverted, all of us desire relationships, right? And it's about finding those people that you can identify with. Who are the people that you can identify with? I can identify with sports fans. I can identify with some Navy guys. I can identify with a little bit of music stuff, not as much as Jeff.
But you have that old retired people.
I do.
I don't have that.
You don't have that, yeah. Thanks,
Not yet.
Matt.
Not a ton
Thanks.
of REO Speedwagon fans here today, Mike, so.
Oh, that is so rough. That was a long, long, long time ago.
That was a long year.
But yeah, who do we identify with naturally? There was a time in my life playing a lot of basketball. I identified with a lot of the guys playing basketball, and so it was, how do I show Jesus within this context? And I think that we sometimes put a lot of pressure on ourselves within those places. Would you guys agree? That it's almost like, okay, now I'm here, I've got to say something, or I need to pray, or you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I don't see Jesus doing that. I see it coming out of the natural flow of his life.
This is something that I think this might lead to one of the later P's, proclamation.
Yeah.
And I struggle. I don't mean to jump ahead on the schedule
No,
here, but it's
no,
conversation.
this is good.
Right? Okay. And this is something that I've always stressed over and struggled with, like many of us. Like, oh, now we've got friends, and I've always been good. Like, I'm better at making friends who aren't church people. I prefer it. And there's always like this pressure, like, I'm supposed to be doing something to guide them down a certain path right now. And again, I feel like God's been revealing to me, like, and lifting that burden in that just live among people, like it says, be friends with people, and also live your life in a way that reflects Jesus. And during the natural course of your human relationships with people, God will open up the appropriate times to just speak into someone's life. I can think of, again, this is my wife's example, but a friend who she's just friends with. They get out and hang out because they both have young kids, and so I'll take the kids for the night, and she can get a drink with this mom. And Bethany has never forced, like, come to my church. People know who we are and what we're about, but we don't force anything on them. We might invite them, but because of that relationship, she has this issue that dealt with the raising of her children in a Catholic church or not, and she's not Catholic, and her family has this. And so she had the opportunity to, the woman asked her, Bethany, you think about this kind of thing, and then Bethany could have a real human conversation with her that is the start of something more, I think. So,
Absolutely.
So God, like this idea that, like, all right, now that we're friends, it's time for the bait and switch. Open your Bible to John. It's the fourth, no, it's just more natural than that. Jesus is more natural than that, especially when, like, in the context of a real relationship that is going to outlast the outcome of that conversation. You have to be natural and respectful. So that was a nice thing I learned this year.
I think that, I'm curious what you guys think. I think we have a tendency to read the Bible not in a story. And to read it as, okay, here this section, these verse 25 through 37 tells me to do this, right? And I've heard it often say, here's your manual for life, right? And I think when we do that, I think we misunderstand and misinterpret what's actually written in here. Now, are there things that teach us and lead us and guide us? Absolutely. But if you read through especially the Gospels and the life of Jesus, I had somebody say one time, read between the red letters. We just read the red letters and we're thinking, okay, Jesus told me this. But read between the red letters and you start seeing the context of Jesus' life come full blossom. And then you start seeing the way that Jesus lived. And when you sit down, Jesus sits with a woman at the well. And we have, again, we read the red letters, and Jesus tells her he's the well of life, or the bread of life, and you want a drink of real water, right? And we don't read like before and after Jesus was probably thirsty. He sat at a well. And this lady came and sat there with him, and they probably started this conversation. And then one thing after another, it allowed him to come to a place of proclaiming who he was. So it kind of leads me to this other idea of prevenience, and that idea that God is already at work in the lives of people all around you. Go ahead, Jeff. You want to say something?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, as we've, it's been interesting because as we've been involved in the music scene, it's kind of transformed here and there, kind of what our role has been. We started off when I was younger playing a lot of church youth groups and, church community centers and stuff like that. And as we kind of got, that was, back, I was just out of high school, and but as the gospel started to make more sense to me, I realized that if our goal is to glorify God and to spread the gospel, then we can't simply be surrounding ourselves with these Christian environments. So we started playing in much more places, to the point now I can't tell you the last time we played at a church, because that's just not our mission field. And so we play exclusively, almost exclusively in bars. Recently, mostly down at the ocean front. And when we started getting plugged into that scene and playing a lot of shows, some of you guys have heard some of these stories before, but one of our shows, when you play bars at the weekend on the ocean front, it's 10 p.m. to 2 a.m., and you get to see people kind of go from being one person at 10 p.m. and they're maybe not that same person at 2 a.m.
Magic.
And yeah, it's transformation. But we've had friends of mine that I've known for a long time get arrested, at our shows.
You guys have got to come to one of these.
We've had, again, it's just because this is the environment that's down there, this is that's the culture down there. And so it was easy to, when we first started playing in these kinds of places, to look around and say, God's not here. It's my responsibility to bring God here because God's not here. But I think the more that we opened up our eyes, and the more that I began to have conversations with people and began to find out more about them, it became more and more evident to me that God is here, and God is already doing some things. And it may not look like what it looks like in some other places, but there's a need, and there's a desire there. We found out all kinds of things. There's a guy who is a mess. He comes to a lot of our shows down there, and he's got a lot going on. And then one time he told me, I used to come see you when I was 12 years old at this Christian youth center that we used to play at. Yeah. And there was this connection there that he feels connected to us, and through that. And there's one of the bartenders at one of the clubs we go down there. We were just, like you said, just naturally having a conversation. I wasn't preaching a sermon after one of our sets or anything like that, but we were just talking, and he asked why we don't play a lot of Saturday shows, and I said, well, I have to be at church at 7 in the morning, and so to get home at 4 and be back at 7 is really tough. So we try to play on Fridays. And that was all it took. He's like, oh, I'm a Christian. I believe in God. And, had this thing where he wants to invest in young people. He's a guy who's made a lot of mistakes and isn't really plugged into any kind of organized religion, but has just been feeling compelled lately that he can be teaching young people a lot based on what he's been through, and wants to invest in the younger generation, and wants for us to sit down and have a talk about what that might look like. And so it's easy to look at some of these places, especially if it's places that you may have a bias against already, and you just look at these places and say, God's not doing anything here. And to feel this burden of, if I were to try to reach into this area, I'd have to bring God with me. And the responsibility and the weight of that would fall solely on my shoulders. And if you do that, you're going to freeze up hard. That's just too much pressure.
Well, I think there's an arrogance behind that, too.
Yeah, and so it's just this idea that God is already, that's that prevenience. Whatever situation you're in, God is already there, and God is already working in that situation. It's just you help discover what that is, and be willing to share the truth of that with people as you become aware of it.
It's another thing that just it takes the pressure off. That you feel like you don't have to be the guy, that God is working through you and thousands of other people, and it's not just this one-for-one basis. Like, I did this for this person. It's what like churches talk about how many people they've led to Jesus over a certain amount of time. It's nice, and it's good. I mean, it's good to celebrate those things, but do you know how many other things have gone on in this person's life before they decided, that led them to here? Like, there's no one person gets credit for pouring into someone's life.
I think I think if we're not careful, though, I'm curious your guys' perspective. I've seen this take and be used in a complete reverse by people within the church. And I think it comes back to more of a heart issue, to where, I can go be with those people, and I can do it under the guise of, I want to show these people who Jesus is. But yet somewhere within that transition, there is a loss of Jesus in that. Does that make sense? You go ahead.
Yeah, I think a lot of that comes down to that last P, that proclamation.
Yeah.
If you live out everything but that, then you're kind of missing one of the more important parts. I think if we look at the Gospels and what Jesus has called, the people that follow him to be a light in the darkness and to be, the salt of the earth. And so I think when you're going into these places, are you, becoming darkness, or are you being a light in that darkness?
Yeah.
And like I said, it doesn't have to look like what you maybe have been told it needs to look like. You don't have to hand someone a tract or lead them through the Roman road, if anybody grew up in Baptist churches or anything like that. But I think it's just, are you, like Mike said earlier, are you making sure that you're representing the gospel and that you're representing Christ, and then you are being that light? And yeah, there may be a lot of dark around you, but are you making sure, it's an intentionality thing again. Are you using it as an excuse, or are you being that light in those dark places?
And I also believe that we often confuse, we think that for me to share the gospel, and this may sound very, heretical, by all means.
Well, let me click record here.
They got it. There's a camera out there.
I think that we often think that for me to share the gospel, I need to sit down and tell you that Jesus died on a cross, that he rose again to forgive you your sins. Now, is that part of the gospel? Absolutely. Salvation is based upon it. But the guy that is at your show, does he need you to tell him that?
I think eventually.
Eventually.
Maybe not, hi, I'm Jeff, shake hands, by the way.
By the way, let me tell you what God did, right?
Yeah, but I think that through investing in the lives of people, there will be opportunities where, there have been opportunities, a guy that you and I have talked about previously, where had no interest in anything until things started falling apart around him, and then when those things started falling apart, I was a guy he wanted to talk to. And there have been other situations where friends of mine have had questions, and so they've started to ask questions, and they say, you should talk to? You should really talk to this guy over here. He's the guy you want to talk to about that kind of stuff. Yeah. And so God will open doors if you're being faithful. But if you just come into those places, and we've had, it's funny, our shows, I swear it has nothing to do with me. Our shows have been picketed, protested by...
I didn't know this. Do you know this, Mike?
Yeah, we one of our Norva shows was protested, and down at the beach, it happened sometime. They're not the same people.
Because of your band? What was the
No, it was just rock music in general. It's not as bad as the Westboro Baptist Church people, but it's that kind of mentality where they'll come out and rock and roll is the devil, and so if you have tattoos, you're going to hell, and if if you drink or if you have your hair cut like Skrillex, you're going to hell, and all this other stuff. And so and it's so interesting. I could go on. Our little timer is almost done, but it's just so interesting. Like, and then you go out to those people and you're like, no, I mean, I understand, and then you like try to have some kind of commonality with those people, with the Christian church people, and they don't want anything to do with it. You know, if you I tried to come out and offer one of these guys because they had been yelling for like 2 hours at people, and so I came out. We were playing, and so we had, you know, in the green room waters and all this other stuff, and so I brought waters to these guys, and I was like, would you guys like some water? And they're checking the cap, you know, to make sure it's still sealed. That's not a joke. They're checking the cap to make, and they were like, no, we're good. And it's like, those people didn't want nothing to do with it. You try to talk about Christ with those people, all they want to do is yell at people and argue. They don't want to have a conversation.
That's not proclamation.
Right, and the people in those communities where they're sitting out with their signs and their megaphones, that's not how you reach those people. If all you want to do is have an argument, you're never going to reach those people. You have to have a conversation, and they weren't willing to do that, even with other people who claim to be followers of Jesus. And so, it's crazy.
As a rule of thumb, if you have to shout your message into a bullhorn, it's probably not a very good message. This is a rule. And the last thing I want to say real quick on proclamation is you talked about that conversation. It's not always that way. Like, there are other people in these people's lives. Sometimes it's just like an invite. Sometimes it could be, hey, what you're going through reminds me of this book I read. Here, read this book. And it gets someone started. It gets someone listening to a podcast. God works in many mysterious ways. It's not always just a
and I think it
checklist.
goes back to that idea of prevenience. What is God already doing within that place, within that maybe that particular person? And that proclamation piece could be me sitting down and saying, man, what's going on? And then be, wow, man, can I pray for you? Really? Sure. Or, sharing maybe a context of your own story and maybe how God has walked with you. Or just sharing, I think your story is always going to have a piece of God within it, because I think God is maneuvering and leading and guiding if our hearts are truly pursuing Christ. So I think God is always going to be within the context of our stories. And so, sit down and, listen to their story, share your story. So I think sometimes that proclamation is that. I think other times that proclamation, I've shared before meeting somebody at Starbucks and God just weighing on me and saying, tell that guy, invite that guy to awaken, right? And there's other people that I meet at a Starbucks that I never say anything about awaken or me as a pastor, because I don't feel like God is telling me to. And so it's, what is God already doing within that context? It's really learning how to listen to God's Holy Spirit lead and direct you, right? And you can't do that if you're not following and pursuing Christ on a regular basis.
Well, and I think that kind of plays into the question that you had asked earlier, too, about, people using this as an excuse or something like that is are you, if you're having natural conversations, if you're sharing your life with somebody, if God's not coming up at some point, then that's probably something you should look at. If you're sharing yourself honestly with somebody, and you are somebody who is pursuing after Christ, then that should be a part of your story. When we play at the Oceanfront, we do a lot of covers, we do a lot of original songs. And for the people that know our original songs, our faith very much comes out in the songs that are originals. Not every single one, but because that's just who we are as musicians and who we are as songwriters, that's going to come out in what we're passionate about. So if you're passionate about following Christ, then it should be part of the conversation somewhere. If you feel like you're having to hide that, then maybe that relationship isn't as genuine and as honest as you were hoping it would be. But yeah, if that's something that you're pursuing, it's going to naturally be a part of that conversation.
Real quick, and we've got to finish up here. The one that we haven't really said much about, I want to make sure we say something about real quick, is the passion of Christ. And that idea of the sufferings of Christ. And there's, you can look up later, Colossians 2:9 talks about us being part of the sufferings of Christ. I think that as followers of Jesus, we can look at some of the trials and some of the things that we walk through. And we've talked a lot about trials the last few months. We can look at some of those things and we can say, well, I don't see God at work in that. Or we can look at those things and say, man, that is such a nuisance, or that is a bother. I wish it would just go away. But I think sometimes that may be one of the biggest things as somebody watches you walk through suffering, watches you walk through trial, whatever it is, with a family member, with a child, with a job, with, whatever it might be, walk through that trial, pointing and proclaiming Christ through that, will change somebody's perspective of who God is. And so I think even this idea of suffering is extremely important as we talk about being Christ in the places that we're in. Is there anything you guys would say to that as we finish up?
Just that requires you to be open and honest with people. If you have a real, genuine relationship with somebody and they don't know that you're going through this thing that is shaking you to your core,
absolutely,
then you're not living in community with them. You don't have a real relationship with them. And so, yeah, that's part of it. That's one of the best ways to proclaim Jesus, is to show how his presence in your life affects the way you walk through really crappy times.
God is still God no matter what I'm going through.
The post that I looked at didn't use passion. It used, but it still began with P. Don't worry. It used, yeah, I know. It used pathos is the word that he uses. But again, it's that idea of suffering with other people. And he said, he describes it as just being compassionate, of being able to identify with other people and their sufferings, and to be, again, as part of that identification, that I have trouble sometimes where I'm good with the whole thing until there's mess, and then I'm like, I got enough mess. I don't want to deal with your mess. But that's not the idea. It's this idea of being compassionate when other people are struggling, that we struggle with them, which goes kind of ties into that idea of we kind of skipped powerlessness a little bit too. So, but that idea of being a servant, being there to serve other people. Not this idea that we don't have power, but like you said, like Christ chose to be a servant despite being God. And that we choose to serve the people around us, and choose to love them both through serving them and also by sharing their sufferings when they have them.
Good. I think one of the most important things to say as we close, I think we're figuring this out. I think we're trying to learn, how do we live like Jesus in the places that we're in. I don't think this is something the church has done real well. I think it's bringing back mission within the context of the church. I think for a long time the church has been about big flashy lights and videos and music, and say, hey, come into my space. And I don't want to say there's anything wrong with that, but I think I would go a step further and say there's something wrong if we are not teaching ourselves how then to be on mission in the places that we're in. Because not everybody is going to feel comfortable coming into this space to see God work in their lives. So how do we then go into their space and take God into those places?
The way Jesus did.
Absolutely. So thanks for being up here, guys.
Thanks.
Give these guys a hand. And as a band comes up and they continue to lead us in worship, I just want to challenge us this new year. How do we take this idea of Jesus walking among us and then sending us to walk among people who don't know who he is? I want you to think about, where does that start for you? What does that look like for you to be intentional? What does that look like? Sometimes it might just be, when I go to work tomorrow, being gone for the holidays, right? I'm going to bring coffee in for somebody, or I'm going to bring a donut for somebody. Maybe it just starts that simple way of saying, how do I serve this person? How do I maybe, instead of just working next to this person day in and day out, how do I start learning their story, learning about their life? And hey, let's go grab some lunch. And I'm not saying you sit down at lunch and let me tell you about Jesus now. I think that you have to say, okay, God, I want to learn how how to listen to you lead and direct me through this. And it's my hope that this year that we might choose, as a people learning what it means to follow Jesus, that we might choose to live this idea of incarnation. Because again, as I said at the beginning, I truly believe that if we choose to walk in that this year, and many of us may choose not to, because it does bring a higher degree of accountability, because now people know who you are, right? But if we truly choose to try to walk into that this new year, I believe, and you can come tell me in 3 months if I'm wrong, I believe that God honors that, and that you will start seeing God do things in your life that you never thought possible before. So, Lord Jesus, thank you for the opportunity for us to worship today. Lord, thank you for the opportunity for us to just have a real conversation about what it means to show you in the places we're in, to be intentional, to build relationships, to love and serve people, and to proclaim the gospel in those places. Proclaim you, Lord, in those places. Lord, help us to reflect as we continue to worship. Help us to sing praises to you, Lord, as a proclamation, so that as we enter into the week, that we enter into the week already proclaiming your greatness and who you are within our lives. Amen.